Humphrey Bogart was born on a quiet Christmas day in 1899, right in the heart of New York City, a date that might suggest a certain sense of destiny for a man who would ultimately help define what it meant to be a Hollywood legend. If you let your imagination wander to that wintry Manhattan morning, you might envision a future star swaddled in holiday spirit and possibility. Yet, looking at that tiny infant, no one could have guessed he would become Bogie, the hard-drinking, world-weary icon whose voice, style, and rakish grin would captivate generations of moviegoers. His life was a tapestry of contradictions, rebellious yet dignified, beloved on camera yet embroiled in scandal off it. Today we're delving into the mesmerizing mosaic of Humphrey Bogart's existence, tracing the scandal-laced chapters that shocked the tabloids and exploring the dramatic final act that took him from the world far too soon. To understand Bogart, you first have to appreciate the cultural landscape he landed in. New York at the turn of the 20th century was a roaring center for vaudeville, theater, and the nascent stirrings of what would become the motion picture industry. The city was electric, the bright marquee lights of Broadway, the push carts and street vendors crowding the avenues, the swirl of new immigrants chasing the American dream. Bogart's father was a respected surgeon, his mother an illustrator who contributed to fashion magazines. From all accounts, he grew up in relative comfort, but not in a household brimming with affection. His parents were busy, well-off professionals. He was expected to follow a respectable path, maybe dabble in the arts as a pastime, but eventually settle into a stable career. Instead, Bogart discovered something deeper in himself, an itch for performance and a restlessness that wouldn't be subdued by the standard route of finishing school and a steady job. It was a restlessness that would color his relationships, his career choices, and the entire trajectory of his life. By the mid-1920s, he had drifted into acting. Some folks argue he fell into it. Maybe he found it simpler than the sort of proper job his family envisioned. Others suspect that from an early age he craved an audience, even if he didn't articulate it that way. His Broadway days placed him in a vibrant community of dreamers, hustlers, and bohemians, a stark contrast from his more conservative upbringing. And that's where he crossed paths with Helen Menken, a stage star celebrated for her striking presence and fiery personality. She and Bogart entered each other's orbits in a flurry of backstage flirtations, late-night cast parties, and intense rehearsals. Their romance flared hot and fast. Menken was older, more experienced, with a formidable reputation in the theater world. Bogart, though still rough around the edges, possessed a disarming mixture of wit and tough guy charm. It was enough to convince her they should wed, but not enough to keep them happy. They married on May 20th, 1926. Almost immediately, the relationship took on an air of melodrama fit for a stage performance. They argued passionately, sometimes backstage, sometimes in public. Certain onlookers caught glimpses of them hissing angry words in dark theater corridors, or saw Menken scold him for staying out too late. The press got wind of it and feasted on the gossip. Rumors of mutual infidelity sprang up, with no one quite sure who betrayed whom first. Menken ultimately filed for divorce just 18 months later, citing mental cruelty. For a man used to coasting on irreverence and good humor, the charge was a wake-up call, or maybe not. Maybe it just confirmed what he already knew, that he chafed under constraints, that relationships with strong-willed women might spark friction, and that he had an almost impulsive knack for sabotage. But in the frenetic pace of 1920s theater life, heartbreak rarely slowed him down for long. Less than a year after his divorce, Bogart tied the knot again. The second wife was Mary Phillips, another Broadway actress whose star was on the rise. She saw something in him, maybe a sense of wounded potential, and for a moment it seemed they could build a supportive life, each encouraging the other's stage ambitions. They married on April 3rd, 1928. At first it looked promising. They played the doting couple at cast gatherings, with Bogart praising Mary's talents, Mary bragging about how her husband was different from other men in the industry. But behind the smiles, old patterns reared their head. Bogart's fondness for alcohol was no mere eccentric quirk. It was edging into genuine destructive habit. Some nights he drank himself into a sullen mood. Then there were rumors of him flying off the handle, culminating in an alleged assault where he punched Mary during a heated argument. Mary tried to keep the full story from the press, but the rumor mill had enough to spin scandalous tales of Bogart the Bruiser and Bogie's booze-fueled rampages. For a time, Mary retreated, focusing on her own career while Bogart's path diverged from the stage and drifted toward motion pictures. By the 1930s, the film industry was exploding. Talkies had replaced silent films, and studios in Hollywood were frantically looking for new stars with dynamic voices, presence, and an edge that would hook audiences. Bogart fit that bill more than he knew. Yes, he was a bit rough, not as matinee idol handsome as some leading men, but his aura carried a world-weary cynicism that resonated on screen. The public was starting to crave realism, a departure from squeaky clean heroes, and Bogart, with his faint scar on his lip, the origin of which is still debated, his sarcastic grin, and the gruffness that seemed to lurk beneath the surface made them sit up and take notice. He and Mary officially separated around 1936, though they dragged out the formalities until 1937. By then, Bogart was already getting close to a new flame, Mayo Methot. If the previous relationships were stormy, the battling Bogart, as they would come to be known, truly took it to another level. Mayo was an actress with a temper, prone to her own destructive binges. Together, they were a powder keg. They got married on August 21st, 1938, in a ceremony that was overshadowed by rumors of brawls leading up to the big day. Neither was afraid of confrontation. Their fights were legendary, complete with thrown objects, broken furniture, and loud curses that neighbors would overhear through thin walls. Bogart famously gave as good as he got, though some accounts suggest Mayo was the more dramatic of the two. One night she reportedly stabbed him with a butcher knife. The next day, he showed up on set with a bandaged side and a dismissive quip, "Just a scratch, kid. You should see the other guy." Under ordinary circumstances, a man with that track record might have destroyed his career prospects. But these were the golden age studio days, and the big executives at Warner Brothers, who recognized Bogart's star power, were skilled at damage control. They could bribe gossip columnists, bury police reports, and spin narratives in the press that portrayed the couple as eccentric rather than downright toxic. Meanwhile, Bogart's roles were steadily improving. In 1941, he broke through with the Maltese Falcon, directed by John Huston. The film established him as a different breed of hero, morally ambiguous, sardonic but strangely honorable when it counted. Then came Casablanca in 1942. Suddenly, he was an international sensation. People across the world fell in love with the image of Rick Blaine, the jaded nightclub owner who'd do the right thing for love. Off-screen, though, the real Bogie was contending with a wife who raged at the slightest hint of impropriety and a lingering emptiness he couldn't quite articulate. Inevitably, scandal found him once more, this time in the form of 19-year-old Lauren Bacall. It was 1944, on the set of To Have and Have Not, and she was an unknown model-turned-actress, carefully chosen for her sultry looks and throaty voice that belied her youth. Bogart was 44, at the apex of his career, unhappy at home, and famously drawn to strong women. The chemistry was immediate. Even the film's crew noticed how he leaned in when she talked, how her eyes lit up when he was nearby, how they could shoot certain romantic scenes in a single take because the tension was real. Mayo Methot, still married to Bogart, got wind of it and flew into a fury. She accused him of betrayal, an accusation that was undeniably true. The ensuing blow-ups at their home reached new heights. Neighbors saw broken windows, heard screaming matches at all hours. The tabloids caught glimpses of Mayo's tear-stained face, Bogart's clenched jaw, and Bacall's uneasy expression. Yet again, the conflict fueled his public image, the rebellious star of the screen, locked in a real-life melodrama. Fans were torn. Some found the relationship with Bacall romantic, pure Hollywood magic. Others were scandalized by the 25-year age gap, the fact that Bogart was a married man. The media, for its part, seized the story with gusto. By the time Mayo and Bogart divorced on May 10, 1945, the affair with Bacall was out in the open, and the couple wasted no time making it official. They wed on May 21, 1945, at Malabar Farm in Ohio. Public opinion teetered between moral outrage, he left his wife for a teenager, and starstruck admiration. This is the ultimate Hollywood romance. Bogart seemed not to care. He famously said something along the lines of, "The only thing you owe the public is a good performance," and he more or less lived by that mantra. The man who'd once been overshadowed by the battling Bogarts now became half of one of Tinseltown's most celebrated duos. Working together, Bogie and Bacall established a brand of cinematic electricity that to this day remains iconic. Films like The Big Sleep and Key Largo showcase their off-screen connection, which was warm, teasing, and occasionally spiky, but always enthralling. If you believed the headlines, it was a complete transformation. From rowdy bar brawler to loving family man, the truth was more complicated. Bogart never really gave up his rebellious tendencies or his love of scotch, and he continued to find trouble where trouble beckoned. In 1949, for instance, he was arrested at the El Morocco nightclub after swinging at a woman who tried to snatch a gift he'd purchased, a small panda toy, for his daughter. The matter was settled quietly when the woman failed to press charges, but the tabloids ate it up. Gossip columns parroted lines like Bogie's bamboo pandemonium, painting him alternately as a bruiser defending a stuffed panda or as a boozed-up star who couldn't hold his temper. He brushed it off with a wry remark, "I'm too drunk to care." It was this duality. On one hand, the Hollywood tough guy, with a drink always in hand. On the other, the tender father who would do anything for his kids, that continued to fascinate the public. When Bacall gave birth to their son Stephen in 1949 and their daughter Leslie in 1952, Bogart took genuine pride in fatherhood, though he never completely curbed his hedonistic habits. If anything, his star power kept climbing. By the early 1950s, he'd already been part of multiple cinematic landmarks. Then came The African Queen in 1951, for which he finally won an Oscar. The once scandal-ridden troublemaker had climbed to the pinnacle of Hollywood prestige. But success doesn't shield you from mortality. Bogart's lifestyle, 2 packs of cigarettes a day, relentless cocktail hours, and minimal regard for medical advice was catching up with him. He was approaching 60 and still holding on to the persona of a scrappy 30-something. In early 1956, the illusions he'd built around his own invincibility fell apart. A persistent cough, dramatic weight loss, and chronic fatigue pushed him to see Dr. Maynard Brandsma at Beverly Hills Hospital. The diagnosis was grim. esophageal cancer. The news, made public only in vague hints at first, shocked Hollywood. Sure, people knew he was a heavy smoker. He practically had a cigarette fused to his fingers in every movie poster. But you never imagine your big screen heroes succumbing to such a punishing reality. Bogart underwent a grueling 9-hour surgery on March 1, 1956, in which doctors removed his esophagus, a rib, and a lymph node. By then, the cancer had already spread. Typical of his stoic persona, Bogart made half-hearted jokes to the press, something like, "They took a rib, but left me the backbone," or a similarly cynical one-liner. But behind closed doors, he was in agony. Bacall, newly in her early 30s, tried to nurse him back to health, encouraging him to consider chemotherapy or more specialized treatments. He refused. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was that rebellious streak that had guided him all his life. He stuck to scotch and sheer willpower. By late 1956, he was confined mostly to bed. Friends who visited him saw a gaunt figure, nowhere near the robust star they remembered. He dropped to 80 pounds, found it nearly impossible to eat, and struggled to keep up the banter he once wielded like a shield. In those final weeks, the house in Holmby Hills became a stage for a different kind of Bogart story. He played the role of a man who knew the end was near, masking the worst of his suffering from his young children and putting on a brave face whenever a friend stopped by. The night before he passed, he slipped into a coma. Bacall, torn between exhaustion and fear, considered stepping out for a brief respite, and he apparently murmured his last coherent words. "Goodbye, kid. Hurry back." After all the roars and rages, the bar fights and stabbings, the unorthodox romances, and the Hollywood triumphs, Humphrey Bogart's exit from life was quiet. At 2:10 a.m. on January 14, 1957, he died at age 57. There was no dramatic moment of cinematic flair, no final scotch-laced flourish. Just a man who'd burned the candle at both ends, departing with something that almost resembled humility. The news tore through Hollywood. Paparazzi crowded outside his home, desperate for a shot of the grieving Bacall. Fans left flowers at the gate. Radio stations broke into scheduled music to announce the death of America's leading tough guy. The older generation felt a pang that signaled the end of a certain golden age, the close of an era defined by black and white films and a code of stoic masculinity that Bogart practically invented. A private funeral followed on January 17th at All Saints Episcopal Church in Beverly Hills. John Huston, who had first believed in Bogie for the Maltese Falcon and guided him through the African Queen, delivered a eulogy that was both simple and searing. "He is quite simply one of a kind," Huston said. There were tears, but also that same ironic fondness Bogart himself had so often projected. The press was not invited to the service, and the funeral itself was low-key by Hollywood standards. No big brass band, no dramatic production, just close friends, family, and colleagues, each reflecting on the complicated man they'd both admired and endured. Bacall had him cremated and placed his ashes at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. In a gesture that captured the soul of their romance, she slipped a small gold whistle into his urn, inscribed with, "If you want anything, just whistle," referencing her line from To Have and Have Not, the film that marked the beginning of their scandalous affair turned iconic love story. In the days that followed, rumors circulated about the final hours. Was there a Catholic priest summoned? Did he convert on his deathbed because of a fear of the unknown? But Bacall dismissed them. Bogart was an agnostic, she insisted, uninterested in last-minute religiosity. If anything, the man who famously told the world he stuck his neck out for nobody was consistent to the end. All at once, Hollywood lost its original anti-hero, and Bacall became a widow at just 32. She had 2 children to raise, along with the memory of a larger-than-life figure whose presence would linger not only in the home, but in cinematic history. The tabloids, who once relished in Bogart's drunken escapades and messy love life, offered tributes that, while heartfelt, couldn't erase the years of sensational coverage. Fans, for their part, found themselves rewatching Casablanca or the Maltese Falcon, searching for that magical spark that had first made them fall for the hard-edged cynic with a romantic streak. They didn't have to look hard. It was there in every line he spoke, every wisecrack delivered with a half-smile. Years turned to decades, and new generations discovered him. Maybe they stumbled on a late-night television broadcast or a film school retrospective. He wasn't a flawless leading man in the mold of Cary Grant or Gary Cooper, but he had an unmistakable authenticity. You could see in his eyes that he'd lived a life as dramatic as any script. The more people learned about his off-screen troubles, 4 marriages, bar fights, arrests at nightclubs, an affair with a teenage Bacall while still married to Mayo Methot, the more they recognized that these roles he played, these cynical but honorable men, were just slivers of the real Bogart. He was neither hero nor villain. He was full of contradictions, loyal yet unfaithful, gruff yet vulnerable, wise yet self-destructive. By the 1970s and 1980s, critics began to reevaluate him as not just a star, but an actor of genuine skill. After all, that Oscar for The African Queen wasn't a fluke. The subtlety of his performances in a Lonely Place, 1950, or The Caine Mutiny, 1954, showed layers beyond the tough guy archetype. Scholars wrote books analyzing his influence on the film noir genre, detailing how his image set the template for the brooding anti-heroes that came after. Even in the 21st century, we see his fingerprints on modern screen icons who try to combine ruggedness with a certain world-weary sophistication. For his family, the memory is more personal. Stephen and Leslie grew up in a Hollywood absent their father, but they carried his DNA in a set of stories that belonged solely to them. Over time, Bacall opened up in interviews, painting a more nuanced picture of the man behind the smokescreen. She talked about the small, ordinary kindnesses, how he'd slip back home from a late shoot and wake her just to say goodnight, or the way he'd grin when he heard his kids playing outside, as if their laughter was a balm to the cynicism that so often clung to him. And of course, there was the reality of living with someone who drank too much, who had a short fuse and wasn't always easy to handle. It was no simple fairy tale, yet in that complexity the romance became richer, more human, and ironically even more admired by fans who admired authenticity. Perhaps that's the ultimate legacy of Humphrey Bogart, not just a set of iconic films, but an enduring example of how a flawed human being can captivate the entire world, warts and all. He never apologized for the life he led or the hearts he broke. He simply owned who he was, laughed at the rumors, and carried on. If that meant scandal after scandal, so be it. If it meant forging a remarkable love story with a woman half his age, the tabloids could chatter while he lived as he pleased. And if, in the end, it meant succumbing to the very vices that fueled his legend, he met that fate head-on with a final wisecrack and a refusal to play by anyone else's script. You can still sense that spirit whenever you hear, "Here's looking at you, kid," a phrase that somehow captures both his cinematic allure and the vulnerability he showed only to a lucky few. Long after his ashes settled in a quiet corner of Forest Lawn, Bogie remains a testament to the fact that legends are born, in part, from a willingness to embrace one's own contradictions, and never let them stop you from taking center stage.